Now that we've segued into the presentations, I'd like to begin with a short discussion about the early history of manga. I think this is an important topic because many people dismiss the medium of manga as something unrelated to classical Japanese fine art. Often you'll hear these critics describe manga as comic books in a pejorative tone. By comic books, they mean works of light-hearted entertainment that are of limited sophistication, depth, and cultural importance. According to this interpretation, manga is a phenomenon that began after the end of the Pacific War. It was pioneered by such artists as Tezuka Osamu, writer of Astro Boy, a science fiction tale about an android who uses his superhuman powers to fight evil and injustice. Another pioneer of the medium was Hasegawa Machiko, writer of Suzae-san, a situational comedy that describes the Fujita family, including the mother Suzae. Originally, the Suzae-san manga was quite controversial, since it described Suzae as a feminist who refused to conform to social expectations placed upon Japanese housewives. Over the following decades, however, the political tone of the stories gradually changed, and nowadays, with its refusal to acknowledge advancements in Japanese society, such as the use of modern technology, it appears quite nostalgic and actually conservative. Although the importance of Tezuka's and Hasegawa's contributions are undisputed, honoring them as the pioneers of Japanese manga, in my opinion at least, ignores the medium's long history before the war. An alternative explanation about the origins of manga, and whether this is more accurate than the previous one, I'm not sure, but an alternative explanation interprets manga as humorous imagery. And it looks back at works of classical Japanese art, such as the scroll of frolicking animals and humans, for similarly light-hearted, whimsical depictions of figures. And it recognizes that it was the woodblock print designer Katsushika Hokusai who originally coined the term manga, meaning unrestrained picture, to describe his sketchbooks. In the early 19th century, other print artists such as Utagawa Kuniyoshi popularized the use of cartoonish characters. And when Japan began to open its ports to international trade in the late 19th century, foreign artists such as Charles Wergman published political cartoons that ultimately led to the accomplishments of Tezuka and Hasegawa. The problem I have with this interpretation is that the precedents for manga are scattered rather sparsely throughout Japanese art history, and also they rely upon the definition of manga as something humorous. And we know that there is a lot of manga nowadays that is quite serious in tone. If we think of manga more broadly as illustrated books and narrative art, however, we can trace with far more clarity its stylistic evolution. We would begin with works of classical Japanese painting, such as the Tale of Genji hand scroll from the 12th century, as well as the Scroll of Frolicking Animals, which appeared in the following century. And as we enter the 17th century, in which the publishing industry arises, we shift our attention from painting to woodblock printed books. At this point, we see the public enjoying both works of classical literature, modern novels, and even reference materials such as encyclopedias. Because of the wide range of literacy among the general public, these texts were elaborately illustrated. The technology for polychromatic printing hadn't been invented yet, and so these illustrations were often hand-colored. In the late 17th century, we finally see books in which the artists are identified. The earliest of these artists was recognized through his style, but he didn't sign his actual name. So since he was active in the Kanbun era, we only know him as the Kanbun master. Soon thereafter, artists began to sign their names. This is a work by the designer Hishikawa Morinobu, and we featured this work in one of our Japanese print exhibitions quite recently. In these works, we see a variety of characteristics: an exaggerated depiction of human figures, a combination of text and imagery, and an eccentric view of the world. This is a bestiary by the artist Toriyama Sekien that features such fanciful creatures as a haunted quilt. The way in which these figures are simplified and the way they're depicted in an endless variety of poses brings to mind the manga sketchbooks of Hokusai that we looked at earlier. However, each of these works is by a different designer, and all of them are published years before Hokusai sketchbooks. So I think it's important for us to realize that the medium of manga was not invented by Hokusai or any other individual artist. Rather, it was an artistic evolution that involved thousands of contributors over the course of several centuries. If fate had been different, then another word such as soga, used here to describe Gekote Bokusen's sketches, might have become the popular term for Japanese graphic novels. But due to his popularity, it seems, Hokusai's description of manga has become the official name of the medium. We recognize the contributions that American cartoonists made in the development of manga in the late 19th century, but even at that time, the Japanese print industry was continuing to evolve. When mechanically reproduced novels became popular among young women in the late 19th century, woodblock prints were added as frontispieces to those books. On the left is an example of one of those frontispieces, and on the right is a contemporary print showing how a reader would open the book and unfold the artwork to admire it. The illustrations in these novels for female readers became increasingly prominent until eventually, in the early 20th century, the imagery and text achieved a special balance that we recognize today as modern manga. And incidentally, this early manga that we're looking at is like the frontispiece that we just saw. It was directed towards a female readership. In the late 20th century, artists such as Tezuka Osamu and Hasegawa Machiko became famous for producing memorable works in this style. And so, while their contributions should not be downplayed, I'd also like to emphasize that their accomplishments stand at the tail end of a distinguished history that spans several centuries. We exhibit works of manga here at our museum, not because it is a fashionable form of contemporary art, but because it is the current manifestation of a long art historical tradition, namely the history of woodblock prints, for which our museum is particularly well known. Thank you very much for your time.